people I know,
Yeah.
whenever you
So
are.
we just started the recording, and thanks everyone so much for joining our next segment in the AQI speaker series, the first one in 2024. We do these about quarterly and bring in basically reentry experts to kind of share their input, expertise, knowledge, and everything else about working the reentry programs or any alternative to incarceration type programs to just help us get better. There's so much knowledge and so much to learn. And I'm just thrilled to have Dr. Amy Lopez on joining me, where we met last year and kind of just were two peas in the same pod, starting our own nonprofits, doing a lot of work in reentry in different ways. And so I want to give a quick shout out very quickly to Judge Zia Faruqi out in Washington, D.C., who connected us. And we've just kind of ran with it for the past year and kind of have a really great conversation about correctional education and reentry programming that works. So, Dr. Lopez, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to just start off with an introduction about yourself.
Hey, hi y'all. I'm Amy Lopez. I'm in Maryland, right outside of DC, but I'm a Texan by birth, so it took me about 50 years to run away from home before I came up Northeast. But I actually started my career as a public school teacher and then a public school administrator, and then ended up in correctional education as the principal of a facility in Beaumont, Texas for youth ages 10 to 21 at the time in maximum security prison in the Texas Youth Commission. And I was principal of the school there. And then the next year was superintendent over all of those schools. And we changed the name, merged with probation, juvenile probation, and became the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. So I was over all the education for that system for a few years, and then went to Wyndham School District, which provides educational opportunities for people that are incarcerated under the Texas, the adult prison system. And so TDCJ, sorry, I couldn't think of it, all the acronyms. And Wyndham is an actual agency, state agency, but also operates as an independent school district. So that was really unique. Lots and lots of students. And then about a year and a half into that, I get a really odd phone call from Sally Yates, who was the Deputy Attorney General at the time, U.S. Deputy Attorney General, and flew me to D.C. And there had been some consulting work around maybe changing the way the Federal Bureau of Prisons operated their educational system. So I was appointed to be the superintendent of education and build a school district inside the FBOP. But right about the time I got there, the administration changed. And so I left the BOP and stayed in DC because I'd fallen in love with the city and was really recruited by the DC Department of Corrections, who had a new director at the time and had very little educational opportunities for residents. And so I was able to go there as the deputy director of college and career readiness and professional development. I felt like every year my title got longer and I got more duties. But and then I was there for 5 years, and about a year ago, I quit the government work and launched my consulting business and a nonprofit's called Hand to Heart DC, where we work with post-release. And as a consultant, I just work with state entities to build educational programs, third-party stakeholders who want to build programs inside prisons and jails. And so I still do that work, but on my own. And that's where I am now.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, for that great introduction and just the vast amount of experience you have at kind of all these different levels of reentry, right? And certainly not as robust and as high up as you had, but kind of had a similar experience where I worked in a lot of county jails, state prisons in California, and just kind of had an affinity for the population and seen how much help can go to change a person's life. And
Yeah.
in all of our conversations, right, we talk about multi-generational aspects in some way or another, right? And I think that's one of our prime motivations for the work we're doing with the reentry population, right? Kind of
Yeah,
changing generational recidivism and
absolutely.
uh
Even my work in the public school system was the same. I always ended up getting the really tough kids because they did really well in my classes. And then when I was an assistant principal and a principal, those are most the kids I knew, right? Were the ones that were constantly in my office and trying to prevent them from going down the road that I eventually ended up working. So I think I always had an affinity for seeing the capacity for change and then helping people to, actualize that even in when I wasn't in corrections. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. So doing things in custody is a whole different ballgame, right? I think there's lots of challenges, and we'll kind of talk about this throughout our conversation today. But the work we do in the collaborative courts, right? It's really getting a lot of stakeholder buy-in to kind of change or implement programs within the court system, right? Where we're trying to improve outcomes. So let's talk a little bit just about your experience with in-custody programming. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the programming that you've implemented and
Sure.
your approach has been.
Okay, so I'll do that, but you butt in
Sure.
and redirect me anytime because this is my favorite thing to talk about, so I can kind of get off on a tangent. But I think that the challenges for um, programming in custody is really about resources, right? And weirdly, it's resources like if you work in a jail setting, you don't have space. I mean, most jails are built to warehouse bodies. I mean, that was their purpose when they were built back whenever. And there's not a lot of space. You also have a limited number of bodies that can teach, so that's a resource that's low. And let's say you do have a classroom and you have in Texas, we'd have like 160,000 people incarcerated, 63,000 of them in school. But even then, there was a waiting list, right? Because if you were going to have a GED class and you have literally can have 12 people in a room, that's it.
Yeah.
That's all you can do. So even though you have a great need and you have a great need and you'd love to serve that great need, you literally don't have space. And a lot of times the resource is not even about money. It's more about just if we had a lot of money, where would we offer this and how would we offer this? So I think those are unique challenges. And this is one of the reasons that you see in prison systems where somebody can't even participate in programming until they're 5 years, till their release date. And it's not that I think that correctional agencies want to waste everybody's time for the 25 years that they were there. It's just that you can't possibly educate, 63,000 people every day, year after year after year, because you just don't have the space for it. There are a lot of unique challenges. I think that for me, sometimes correctional agencies get a bad rap, and you're like, you just don't realize that how little resources sometimes that they have. So having said that, it is a boon if you can be very creative and you can leverage things like partnerships, if you can leverage things like technology, and if you can really think, sometimes thinking outside the box. But I will say that there are a lot of educational programs that I've implemented, and people are like, "Oh, this is so innovative," and I say, "I've been doing that in public school." It's evidence and research based in public school. What makes it innovative is that we've just never done it inside the prison walls. And there are a lot of reasons for that too. And some of it is also, we'll say, problematic in that correctional agencies sometimes promote correctional staff to education positions without hiring people that are certified educators. And so they just don't have that breadth of experience in instructional strategies.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question, right? Or a great approach, right? We're about who can actually go into institutions to conduct this education,
Mhm.
and who should be qualified, right? And how do we do different models where we're trying to bring in community members? How do we get approval from stakeholders who have reservation and limited resources? So one thing I'd love to pick your brain about, right, is in the collaborative courts, right, we need tons of stakeholder support. And we're lucky when the U.S. attorney, the public defender, our judges, probation officers, pretrial and probation, they're interested, right? And we're all working towards better outcomes. But how do you reach out to in-custody stakeholders to try to, pitch them your proposals and programs?
Or if you're the outside stakeholder partner, I mean, knowing the key person to ask is huge. I mean, it's all about relationships, right? And knowing who to ask. Um, from a from my standpoint, working inside, I would rarely say no. The only time I would say no is if, I just couldn't see the value to
Mhm.
the residents, the
Sure.
students, or to my agency. I couldn't see the relevance. I would say no, but I can't even really think of times I've said no because I just had a lot of quality people ask me. And so I think the best way is to create something that's relevant. And you,
Mhm.
you have to think about what the correctional facility needs, what the student needs, and what the community is going to need, because anything you provide program wise, it needs to prepare somebody for successful reentry and employment reentry and being able to stay free from justice involvement. So all of those things are what skills are they? And I would say too that one of the failings I see a lot in prison systems when it comes to programming is that sometimes they're not very strategic about the outside partners, right? And
Mhm.
so you'll see places that have absolutely closed doors and nobody gets in.
Sure.
You see that sometimes. Like, the answer is always no.
Yeah.
And then you see some places where, like I've gone into a system before and said, you have 200 and some odd volunteer groups, and I can't tell what they do.
Yeah.
And they do come in, you've got 10 that do the same sort of programming, and then how is it that that's helping an individual get to your ultimate goal?
Sure.
So if you're an outside stakeholder, I would say find out what the goal is for the facility you want to go in. Are they trying to reduce recidivism? Are they trying to fill leisure time? Are they trying to get industry certs so that people have employability skills? What is it that they need?
Right.
And then you should meet that need, and your
Right.
chances of getting in and doing it are going to be higher.
Right, right. So I love that approach, right? And it's very parallel to our collaborative work, right? We're trying to identify a need, be smart about it with assessments and who we're contracted with, right? And then
Mhm.
trying to fill that need to have a better outcome. Um, let's talk a little bit about your successes, right? And if you could share a few stories about technology or programs
Sure. I
implemented,
love I love
love to hear
stories.
successes.
Good storyteller. So, okay, let's see what I want to start with. Let's start with technology, because I do think that having that as a foundation for so much of what I was able to do thereafter is huge. So I'm going to put a disclaimer. I want to talk about a company called Origin. They're formerly known as APDS, and they do create or they manufacture a tablet that is connected to a secure Wi-Fi. So the residents are never out on the internet, but it mimics that. So the students are getting 21st century technology skills. And we just, because of my partnership with them, I actually started working with them in 2014 back in the juvenile system in Texas. And everywhere I go, I just carry them with me because
Yeah.
they've been such great partners and they've evolved so much. But so I will say as a disclaimer, I do consult with them now, but I don't talk about them because I consult with them. It's the opposite. I consult with them because they were such brilliant partners for me
Uh-huh.
to provide education. So the so the way we really expanded that program in DC was sort of a silver lining. But we started with about 50 of those tablets. And these are it's an educational platform that is at no cost to the resident. So just want to put that out there. Students aren't paying, the inmates are not paying for anything.
Mm.
And it's all educational based. So these are not the communication tablets that you hear about in prisons. These are educational based. And so we started off with about 50, and we had in DC Department of Corrections, we didn't have any post-secondary offerings. And so we started with Ashland University for credit-bearing courses. And then once I got those tablets in the door and everybody saw that nobody was going to use them as a weapon to kill anybody, or nobody got out on the internet, which is huge. I
Right.
laugh about that, but security is huge. So if
Yeah.
you're going to propose programming and you can't convince and show that it's going to be, you know, a secure environment, then you're not going to get in, because that is a number one priority, and there are reasons that it's number one priority for correctional agencies. So I got those in the door, and then we were able to buy a couple hundred more, and then a couple hundred more, and then down the road, COVID hit, and our two facilities went on a 23-1 lockdown.
Mhm.
And our mayor called and said, "What do you need?" And my director and I just said, if every resident had a tablet, then when they're locked in, they would have something productive to do. And then suddenly I went from having 400 people in education to having 1,800 a day, right?
Gosh, okay.
So some of the things on that tablet that really helped us is there are things you can purchase, like, you know, GD prep and, you know, licenses for programs that students are self-paced going through.
Yeah.
But I asked if we could have a learning management system on those, and they put it on there. And so remember, all of this is secure, doesn't go to the internet at all.
Yeah.
But having an LMS on there meant that we could create our own programming. Our university partners could create programming. And then we had this whole thing around students who have disabilities that are still in a high school diploma program. So you have a federal law that says they have to receive services, and suddenly they can't receive services because the local school district can't come in.
Mhm.
And I called Origin and said, "Why can't we have a virtual app? Can you do that without the internet?" And they did make that happen. So just like what we're doing today,
Yeah.
our students could receive live instruction, they could chat to the professor. And so suddenly it was a huge game changer, right? You could just implement so many courses and leverage so many partnerships. And we loved it as an agency because it was also safe. Like,
Yeah.
we didn't have to do all the clearances of people actually coming in the building. You still did background checks, right? But it was a really great solution.
Mhm.
And then, you know, it just kind of went from there. I think I was talking to you before this, we got really creative. We had a newspaper, we digitized the newspaper and put it on there. We
Yeah.
decided to have our own podcast because every resident had, you know, a tablet. And one of the partnerships I was able to leverage. So if there anybody here who is trying to do programming inside, one of the great byproducts of having great programming and then letting the media come in to talk about it is that you get more and more partners
Mhm.
that want to work with you. And one of those was the National Women's Judges Association. And a woman called me and said, "We want to do something inside with you, but we don't know what." And so we settled on a podcast, and they worked with our students. And every month, the women judges and our students, you know, had a podcast episode that was about women's issues with, you know, domestic violence or childcare, whatever. And these
Mhm.
judges would say, "When you get home, this is what you should do.
Yeah.
This is where you should go." Those kinds of things are really unique,
Yeah.
that we wouldn't have had if we didn't have that technology. And that's just besides people being able to earn industry certifications and get their GED and take college courses. You know, there were a million ways we used those tablets for programming. It was a
Right.
real game changer for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible and something that I think just working with our population, right? Education
Mhm.
becomes so important, but it's not always a given, right? And not always
Right.
seen as a benefit, right? Sometimes it's almost incentive to get a reduction in sentence, right? I'll do it because I'm going to get out sooner.
Yeah.
When we get really purposeful learning, right?
Mhm.
One of our judges always jokes that, so many of our clients would be great Stanford MBAs if they just took a little bit of a career path
I
difference.
know.
You know,
Yeah, you know, and the good news now is that there's been such a dearth of post-secondary education inside since the elimination of the Pell Grant, and with the reenactment of that, and we've just seen way more universities and colleges asked to come in.
sure.
There's such a willingness when you were talking about volunteering, right?
Mhm.
There's a willingness to come in and help. We just have to figure out what we need and be strategic about it, and
Yeah,
then open the doors and work collaboratively and make it happen. But there's no shortage of folks who have great solutions and want to come
yeah,
offer this to you.
Absolutely, right. And kind of the results of a pandemic, right? We were all forced to
Mhm.
kind of get creative in how we did
Yeah,
outreach and be satisfied with the programming that we were implementing and
yeah.
created some really interesting things. So I'm gonna ask one more, maybe a bit of a challenging question before we move on to the actual post-release or reentry work that you're doing.
Mhm.
You know, I think over the last 2 or 3 years, with so much social justice movement and just kind of attention to incarceration and policy change, right? The idea of incarceration has just been a very interesting topic from a lot of different perspectives. And so, for people who don't, kind of live in the criminal justice system or just kind of the general public, um, what would you kind of say to them about the program that you're implementing when they're thinking that, if you're in custody, you're there because you committed a crime and it shouldn't be fun, it shouldn't be better. But what will kind of the approach or, your reasoning be?
Yeah. So, I'm an academic person, so always think about rational choice theory. And rational choice theory is this idea that we all make our choices every day based on kind of a pros and cons list, even if it's just in our head, right? We say, oh, should I do this? And then, you kind of run through your head, well, if I do this, I'll get this and I won't get that, or this will happen, that'll happen. In the end, you make a choice. I mean, most of the time you make a choice that's rational. It seems irrational to you anyway, right? And that's rational choice theory. If we apply rational choice theory to criminology, the field of criminology, and it can still look like that, right? That people think crime is a rational choice. And so the way I describe it is this: if I live in poverty, I have no educational training, I have no job skill training, I don't have a familial or a professional network. If I'm a dropout, if I have an addiction, if I have all of these things, right, then crime looks like a rational choice. And if we apply that to the work that we do inside, if you opened those doors and gave people the opportunity to have an education, to have job skill training, to have a support system in and out, pre-release and post-release, if they had a professional network, if they had the skills to have a job with a living and sustainable wage, if all of those things were made available and they took advantage of it, would they make better choices? And we hope the answer is yes. And then I will tell you anecdotally, what I see is yes, the answer is yes. Does
Right.
everybody take advantage of that? No. Does everybody overcome substance use and, all of those things? No. But the majority do. And we see that even in research.
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of a dearth of research as well about the impact of pre-release programming on post-release success, though, that I would love to see researchers do more. The kind of seminal research project right now, our report is the RAND report that was published. It was published in 2013. It's
Mhm.
been a while, right? And even then, that was a meta-analysis of other studies that went all the way back, like I think 70s or something.
Right.
But even that showed that pre-release programming and education, increased the odds that someone would remain justice involved, free from justice involvement once
Yeah.
they're released, and the recidivism rate goes down. And so there's a lot of evidence that it works. And also, I just cold hard facts: 95% of the people incarcerated come home, y'all.
Right. Right.
And when they come home, who do you want in your neighborhood and who do you want next door to you? And, and giving those people a chance. And we keep saying we're a nation of second chances, so we need to believe it,
Sure.
because folks do need that. And that's always just my argument. And I'm like, you have to get behind humane treatment and you have to think about that, but it's not. I will tell you, I've never seen anybody enjoy incarceration. Just gonna tell you that. There may be some bright spots where they're so thankful for what they have, but I've never met anybody
Yeah.
that enjoyed their time of confinement. It's
Yeah.
not a fun time. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And we'll start talking about Reentry Court in a moment, but just want to shout out to everyone in the audience, right? Feel free to type in questions or comments. We'll go ahead and acknowledge them and kind of read through them as we go through this. But just thinking about our Reentry Court, which is purely post-release, right? And kind of that really interesting challenge where they may be living at the halfway house and be technically a prisoner of the BOP, but in the community, right? We're finding these different needs to address. And oftentimes it's connection and opportunity, right? And unless someone has a very, very strong will, right? It's going to take a few stumbles and a few tries to kind of iron out behaviors and get people acclimated. But kind of going back to your technology piece, right? A lot of clients that were down for 10, 15 years were in a different world from the internet, right? And we're applying for jobs with a Bluetooth in, right? A paper resume going store to store saying, I'd like to apply
Yeah.
for a job. And everyone's looking at them like, what are you talking about? We don't take paper. Like,
Yeah.
and it shows a kind of a dated approach. So I love that idea of kind of technology preparing people with skills and experiences to address how they're going to be in the community. So let's move on a little bit to your reentry work. And I think just as a definition, we think of reentry as just post-release, right? Whether it's from state or federal prison, someone's been incarcerated for at least a year or more, oftentimes on some type of supervised release where they're reporting to an officer, and the work that you're doing in the reentry space. So tell me a little bit about Hand to Heart and kind of the work
Yeah.
that you're doing with your group.
So I didn't have a lot of post-release experience, but my last year in the DC space, I kind of had a grant fall in my lap, and this is also how it goes sometimes, right? Somebody called me and said, this grant money was given to somebody else and then they didn't spend it. So do you want it? And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, heck yeah, I always say yes to money. And it was like $2 million or something. So it's for
Wow.
me, you all may not think that's a lot, but for
Yeah.
me, I was like hot dog. And then they said, you need to encumber the money in 7 days. And I was like, there's always a catch. And so what I did is sit down with three of my staff members who were also justice impacted that
Mhm.
I'd hired. And in those 7 days, we designed a post-release program because we felt like that was really the big gap. So we had all this inside programming, and then folks would hit the gate, to leave.
Yeah.
And then, 3 months, we'd see them right back.
Mhm.
And so we designed that program in that 7 days and ran it for a year. And it was it was just insanely successful. And so then when I went off on my own, I got those same folks.
Yeah.
And so they were part of my nonprofit. We founded it together and we were just like, I think that was the most impactful thing in my career that I really saw that really made a difference in whether folks could stay outside and be successful or go right back in.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's just the same. We know, right? We all know what they need. It's almost impossible to find housing. That's the huge one.
Everywhere. Yep.
Yes, it's so hard. And the ban the box is great, but it still doesn't mean you're not discriminated against. It just means you're discriminated against later. Right? It's not earlier, but it's just really hard. And I'm just I always feel like I have to put disclaimers. I totally get why there's people don't want folks who have a criminal history
Yep.
living in buildings or what. So I totally understand that. But it just exacerbates the problem
Yep.
when they can't find housing. So we saw that. We saw folks that would get out, and we had a gentleman who left, and literally every family member he had that he knew had died while he was incarcerated.
Mhm.
And he stepped out with nothing, no clothes, no housing, you know, no family support, no job. He just had nothing. This is a big issue in the US, I think, is that we say, oh, people need to do better. And then they walk out, they're not even at ground zero. They're like in a hole that they somewhat dug themselves, but
Sure.
we all helped, society helped dig it even deeper and then give them very few skills to know how to climb out of it.
Yeah.
So in the reentry space, we see a real need for, the same thing inside education, job training for a career, not just a job.
Yeah.
I'll say that supervision is hard. I did not realize how difficult it is to be on supervision until we started working with people, just not being able to, they find a job and say they can't have it.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know. It's a laundry list of issues with
Yeah.
halfway houses and supervision that I think there's just a disconnect
Yeah,
about
so let me
how
have
to
you pause right there
work.
for a moment too, because so much of the work that I do is with probation officers. I know we have a couple
Mhm.
officers on the call who are wonderful, and I think in our district in particular, right, we've done an incredible job bringing kind of like a social work perspective, right, with more
Yes.
community outreach, a lot of community supervision, where it's this approach, right, where we're moving away from the nail them, tail them, and jail them, but really
Hmm.
trying to have impactful change. So,
Yeah.
from your perspective, what kind of collaboration would you envision having with officers? And how do you think kind of this partnership and collaboration towards
Mhm.
treating a reentry person
So
look?
we have really great partnerships. But again, I think that the problem with halfway houses and supervision is not the folks that are in it because they're compassionate but again, it's a lack of resources. It's a workload that's just almost impossible for them to keep up with.
Yeah,
But it's just difficult to navigate all of that for the number of people that they have to serve. So our partnerships, that's one of the ways that we really try to ease their burden
yeah,
is, what our partnerships with probation officers is what can we take off your plate?
mhm,
What could be easy or usually make it easier for you so you can do these things and we can do these things
yeah,
because if you don't have those partnerships, halfway houses and probation officers are trying to find people food and clothes and
right,
housing. I mean, it's all on them. So community partnerships are huge in taking that burden off of those folks.
yeah,
And that's been where we've been the most successful. And when we also report back to each other, right?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, we'll say, can you help out? He needs to get from here to there. And we're like, hey, we'll go pick him up, things like that. So if your community organization being open and serving where you're needed, I think is huge.
yeah,
I think sometimes we want to do this one thing, and the folks that are tasked with these difficult jobs need other types of support. So be open to the other types of support that they need.
sure. Yeah, and
Mhm.
I think that's a great way of putting it, right? Where we work closely with the officers, and they play such a difficult role, right? They're law
Yeah,
enforcement, but they're
I just did
officers.
not realize how hard it was
Yeah,
until we really delved into post release. And I'm like, oh my, I don't know how I can see the burnout in that job
yeah,
too, because there's a lot of compassion fatigue with probation folks and in halfway houses. And it's a tough gig.
yeah, right. That vicarious trauma, right, where you're dealing with
Mm,
such challenging situations,
yeah, yeah,
and you want to alleviate their work, right, so they can go do
yes.
officer work. And so I love that approach where, I rely on officers to hold people accountable, right, and
Hmm.
having difficulty and having someone show up. I definitely like reach out to the officer, hey, I just need some help to get this person to our meeting, but we can actually help them together. And so it's this great kind of balance and partnership.
Hmm.
So that's
Yes.
incredible.
Yeah.
Um, just in addition to kind of the programs that you've implemented in custody and the things that you want to do out of custody, what are some things that you're noticing with the reentry population that you think can kind of be a standard, to help people kind of move the work that you're doing, uh,
Mm.
to kind of not be unexpected or out of the norm?
I so like okay, tell me again.
So, just kind of like what like standards or like if there's something that was necessary to kind of implement all these programs out of custody, what kind
Mhm.
of standard would you have for implementing programs for the rental population?
So I think that again is looking at where the need is, and I do think that cognitive behavior therapy
Mhm.
training is huge. If people can just learn to be cognizant of their own thinking and then change their behaviors based on that. And again, we have returning citizens or justice impacted folks who teach that because they've been there and they can talk about that. And I think it's difficult that we return folks back to their neighborhoods and then it's really easy to fall into habits. So I think a standard should be having a regular meeting place where people can go that's safe, right? When I'm thinking about doing something I shouldn't, where can I go and who can I have? And this is another way we can augment the work of folks that are in charge of post-release supervision is to provide mentorship,
Yep.
right? Where they have one more person or three more people to go to who are going to say, hey, get back over here, or you need this, we'll help you find this, but don't go out and get it in that way.
Right.
Because folks just get desperate and they often won't maybe go to their PO because they're afraid they'll get in trouble, right? Whereas if they'll just come to a safe space, you can say, oh, you got here in time, right? You got here before you did something you shouldn't do. But I think mentorship and then just, and also helping folks with job placement is huge. So one of the things that we teach all the time is digital profile, having your digital profile and what a job board is, because like you said, you're not looking in the want ads anymore and filling out a paper app. And having folks available to sit down with them and really think about what career do you want, what are your transferable skills, what skills do you have, and then helping them move forward.
Sure.
Those are all just hand holding things. It's like, when your kid leaves for college for the first time and you walk them through all the paperwork and you show them all of that. It's very similar to that when people come home. They just are having to navigate in a world that's really
Right.
foreign to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, something that we observe so much, right, is that our clients aren't used to getting positive phone calls from their
Mhm.
officer or someone from the court, right? And so
Mhm.
that 10-second investment on a Friday to say, hey, hope you're doing well through this week. Uh,
Mhm.
Please have a safe weekend and let me know if you need help with anything. We have
Mhm.
clients coming in court on Monday saying, I've never had an officer reach out to me for something good. Every time it's always coming in the UA, come in and get violated. And so that small investment time really changes people's attitude and behaviors towards the entire system. And
Mhm.
once we're kind of having that different perspective, that's when we're really looking at that generational change, right? Where there are
Yeah.
judges that care, there are officers that can help me. The indictment was warranted, but now it's gotten me access to different services that have improved my life. And that's where I think we see the real change in reentry in that mindset. Uh,
Mhm.
so one more question, and I just want to kind of compare because we're in very different geographical locations, and then we'll hopefully ask you to share a couple of photos and kind of share a little bit about your programs. But um, doing your work in DMV and have so much experience in Texas. I'm based in San Francisco. Um, how do you think just geography or district by district, region by region, whatever you want to call it, changes when it comes to how we help the reentry population?
Yeah. So I think that culture has a lot to do with it, right? And the paradigms that different places have about criminogenic behavior and, what kind of a stigmatization, I guess.
Mhm.
And so place like DC, there's not as much of that.
Sure.
It's smaller, right? And then everybody's kind of born and raised in the city. And like, for instance, DC is very resource rich when it comes to organizations that help everybody from youth to folks that have been incarcerated for 30 some odd years and coming home. And a place like Texas is so large
Yeah.
that in one state, it's like depends on the city. And then also in Texas, you may be incarcerated somewhere and your home is 14 hours in the bottom of the state. And so it's a much harder lift, I think, for states like Texas that are just geographically large to come up with consistent systems
Yeah.
and practices, because every area of the state has its own culture, really.
Sure.
So I do think that that's much different. But I couldn't say like, oh, people in the South don't care as much or they're too
Sure.
conservative, or I don't see that at all. I think it's just personalities of different cities and also resources that places have.
Right.
But I personally experience way more compassion in correctional with
Mhm.
correctional staff, with supervision staff, and with community about doing the best we can for folks than I ever encounter people that are resistant to it,
Yeah,
which to me is very hopeful. Like I just very rarely find people that are like, they just deserve what they get. I just don't
totally.
really find that inside prisons, outside prisons, anywhere. And I think that is good. I don't know what it was like, 30 years ago before I got into this. I think I've been working for 38 years. But in my time period, it just seems like we've had a lot of compassion
Yeah.
about that. But I do think resources can be very different in different places.
Yeah, and I think that's been kind of a common theme where we've seen, people are just exhausted by that revolving door, right? And judges, attorneys, right, tired of prosecuting the same cases and getting the same outcomes, where
Mhm.
looking for any type of different intervention. Where I know kind of like my personal interest, right, is kind of this idea of more public health into the court system, right, where we're identifying behaviors, we're getting people
Yeah.
comfortable and confident with going to a doctor instead of not knowing how to access care,
Mhm.
incentivizing behavior change, because it's hard, right? When all that you
Yes.
know is one way of doing things to change
Mhm.
behaviors.
Mhm.
So it's a really great time, I think, to get people just kind of curious, interested, and it's across, multiple industries, right? It's not just public health, it's not just criminal justice, but tech,
Right.
education, everyone
Yes.
kind of just wants to do better.
Yeah. So I think that's a really great time to I just remembered we had a program that where with the tablets that we had, they had forged a partnership with Amazon, and they piloted an AWS certification
Hmm.
program on the tablets in the jail there at the DC. And so the students took the coursework on the tablet. And then once a week, I think, as once a week or every other week, we had a guest speaker come in either from AWS or people that were cloud practitioners that could come in and talk about the job. And then we tapped into a couple of residents who had that position, before they were incarcerated, who did study groups, and we had like I think about 20 gentlemen who got their certification in AWS cloud as a cloud practitioner. And one of those, I'll show you that picture right quick because it's one of my favorites. But let me see if I can find this gentleman's name is Julian, and he took the cloud practitioner. Let's see. Here's the story about it. And then Julian took it. So here he is. And then I always joke with students inside and say, someday if I need a job, I'm going to work for you, right? Or I will work with you. And then sure enough, when Julian got out, he got a job with Origin, the tablet company actually hired him. And here we are. And I'm not in the picture, but we're speaking on the same panel. We're at the same conference, right? And I think that that's a really great example of how a third party, like a tech company, a big tech company says, there's a gap. We need workers. What's this place that has workers but can't get jobs?
Mhm.
Oh, it's justice impacted people. And, how can we tap into that workforce?
Sure.
And then finding the pathway to make that happen. And those are partnerships that should happen more frequently. And I will say that I'm huge on if you're going to train somebody in a career, that it needs to have a nationally recognized industry cert right behind it, so
Yeah.
that when you have at least a little leverage when you go in to say, I know I have a criminal history, but also don't have a certificate that says I took, social emotional learning in the prison. I
Sure.
actually took the AWS certification course, and here's my certificate. So I'm
Right.
I'm employable. And I think that those types of partnerships and leveraging those types of partnerships inside and out, because AWS has that same kind of programming outside
Right.
for justice impacted folks, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's this confidence, right? Where I think everyone just kind of at the end of the day wants to go to a job that they're satisfied in, that
Mhm.
pays them a living wage.
Yes.
And we see it so commonly with the Reentry population where,
Mhm.
they get that any job, right? That one
Yeah.
that's just kind of, I have to take it and it's going to pay me minimum wage, but it'll be good for right now. And then suddenly become dedicated to it, right? Where they're so committed. And we get it commonly with like Goodwill and Salvation Army, who do great jobs, employing. And then at some point they learn too many skills, right? And they're not being
Right.
challenged enough, and they need to kind of go into that better job or that career job, and kind of without that soft skills and confidence to
Mm.
get there, right? Without that kind of community support to nudge them along and help them deal with the behavior change towards professional development. They get kind of stuck and muddled, which is really challenging.
Yeah, and I think soft skills are really key. So in our reentry work, when we find people employment and they have all the hard skills and they have the technical skills, they have the certifications, and we've never had anybody get fired from a job for lack of technical skill, but
Mhm.
we've had plenty get fired for lack of soft skills, right? And it's just
Right?
simple things like, I was sick 3 days. Well, did you call? No, I didn't know I was supposed to call. It's just like things like that where they have a good reason. They just
Right.
didn't know the procedures. And I think that's another thing we do in our reentry work is that we work extensively with employers
Yep.
that are going to hire our folks to say, look, it can be a roller coaster, man, right? So again, like we were talking about trying to take the burden off of probation officers, we also try to take the burden off of employers to say, when you're struggling with him, give us a call, and or we'll go talk to her and we'll say, what's the problem? How can we alleviate that? Because you need to get to work and you need to do these things. And that's one way that reentry organizations can really help, is just by seeing the need of the client, the justice impacted person, but also seeing that just that alone causes a burden for other organizations or employers and
Sure.
probation and halfway houses and people that are trying to do their job. So what's the need of each one of those entities, and can we be an organization that meets those needs or takes that burden off of you?
Right, right. I mean, that's a great point. I just want to acknowledge such, and thanks for that comment and kind of telling stories, who works in tech and has been a mentor, part of our professional mentorship initiative, where these soft skills that you're talking about is something that we work on, right? Where
Yes.
one, you have to call if you're going to miss work, right? And kind of hard, and it may be difficult because they feel that their employment is so fragile, where they miss
Yes,
one day, then they're going to be
that's
terminated.
true.
But at the same
Yeah.
time, you also deserve to ask for a raise when you put in a lot of work and there's an opportunity for that. And so,
Yeah.
just kind of coaching where if you're paying taxes on your employment, right, which oftentimes it's the first time for our populations, and there's a lot of people that have never paid taxes before,
Mhm.
there's a process to do it. And gosh, I wish I had someone throughout my first or second job to kind of tell me like, hey, it's okay to take a day off, right? Like, please do.
Yeah, because every time we have a participant who gets his paycheck and he's like, what did they take? And we're like, yeah, we feel you, man. Right.
It's tough.
Been
It's
feeling that way for
really-
40 years.
yeah.
Yeah. That's how it goes. But I think that's a good point too, Wyatt, is that these are things that we know and have experienced, since we were teenagers
Yeah,
working. And a lot of folks who come out, they never worked.
right.
So they may have been in 20 years and you're like, remember when you had a job? And they're like, no, man, I was selling drugs on the
Yeah,
street, or I was, homeless, or I was, doing whatever. And
experiencing some terrible trauma. Yep.
they didn't have a job. So it's all of it's new and all
Right.
of it's a teachable moment.
Exactly.
Everything's a teachable moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we approach kind of just the last 10 minutes, just again, want to open it up. If there's any questions, please do feel free to type them out, or we'll ask people to turn on their cameras or microphones to ask questions in a moment. But our whole goal of these speaker series is to just try to give some information to our collaborative court staff, about different ideas that we can bring to our collaborative courts, or just generally working with the populations that we work with. So what's one thing you'd want a judge, an attorney, an officer, a community worker, a court administrator, to take away or understand about corrections and reentry education?
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to tell another story, but the way you and I met, Wyatt, was through Judge Faruqi, who's a U.S. magistrate here in D.C. And he'd call me one day and said, I'm Judge, he never says judge, he never calls himself a judge. He's I'm Zia Faruqi, and how can I help? And we forged this partnership, and he was instrumental in getting a program inside for us that was a partnership with MIT. And I think that is what I would say take away, is that, again, where's the need? And one of the things Judge Faruqi does is he may sentence somebody, and then he would come the next day to the jail and sit down with the guy and go, what's your plan? Because your reentry starts now. So when
Yep.
you come back to me, when you come back to my reentry court, right? I want to know you've worked your plan. And I think that that kind of collaborative partnership where, and judges and people that work in the court, they probably see the outside problems way more than we see inside, right? We only know we're isolated, but we don't see the returning coming back. Why are they coming back? So to know that root cause and to be able to collaboratively say, this is the root cause of what we're seeing. How can we all fix it and how can we do our part? I think that that would be invaluable. Our partnership with Judge Faruqi, Judge Frederick, I mean, it started snowballing, right? Once one judge came in, then all the women came in, and then the women judges, and then it was like a huge collaborative effort to fix a community problem.
Yeah, yeah, that's incredible. And we get one person interested and another person snowballs, and it just kind of moves in more and more momentum where I love the work that we do because it allows for creativity, right? We're
Yes.
to really
Yeah.
think about, this large system that's necessary, but we get to identify different ways to kind of approach things and implement change. And it's such a powerful component. So
Yeah.
Dr. Lopez, thanks so much for sharing all that. Let's move into just a couple of questions in your dialogue. Candice, who's just an incredible public defender that I work with, and Candice, feel free to jump in if I'm not capturing a question well, but kind of total correspondent courses via mail, college class options. Do you have any experience or thoughts about that certification?
A little bit. So we don't see them as, I feel like we don't see them as often now as back when I started. But so is it as good as an in-person or as effective as in-person class? Probably not. You might could argue that. But we did all of Ashland University, which was on the tablets, and when we started, there was no virtual app, so there was no, live lecture or anything, which is similar to correspondence. The students did fine. We made study groups or whatnot.
Mhm.
But I would say if that's the only option you got, absolutely. I mean, any education, right? Any way to better yourself is a plus. So I would never say no to any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things I learned is that people in custody are just looking for some type of connection, right? And that's why when volunteers or programs are implemented, we're just sitting down for tea and a conversation about any world events right now that you can share, some connection with is such a powerful motivator to keep your head in there, right? While you're going through the challenges of being in custody, but also start to prepare for what your life looks like
Yeah.
post-release.
Yeah. And if you find any, Candace, if you find any good correspondence course programs, let me know because there are always places looking for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing. So, for anyone that kind of works at the state level, right, in the federal Bureau of Prisons, right, you kind of go to where there's an open bed and there isn't always a reentry kind of program or space to kind of access. And so, are there any like partnerships that you envision being kind of modeled at multiple BOP facilities or kind of becoming a standard for what education can look like at the federal level?
So I think that the key there would be standardizing something,
Mhm.
right? But I think it still operates, and Texas operate a lot like this in some ways that each facility is just kind of based on the warden and what's in the area that's available. Some places had robust resources outside and not. But in the BOP, I just found that it was just so different across the board that I
Mhm.
think standardizing anything. And I would say if you didn't have anything else, have GED, some sort of high school equivalency and cognitive behavior therapy, everybody ought to have that.
Yeah.
Everybody ought to have that. 73% of the jobs in the US require a high school credential. So if you get out without that, the odds that you're going to get a sustainable living wage are really low.
Right.
So those things I would standardize, but then make it to where you actually, try to make it available to everybody. And that's one way technology does help.
Yeah.
I have a friend that one of my nonprofit partners who he was incarcerated in the federal system and he took his GED 4 times because he was bored. And I'm like, somebody wasn't checking right to see, or he was lying, which is
Yeah.
probably more probably more likely. But to make that available to everybody, right, I think would be a really great place to start with standardization. It's hard to do post-secondary as a standard because some places don't have a community college or university nearby to be able to provide that. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah. And I think that's one thing that we've dialogued about where you mentioned MIT, right? And I know I'm working on and just shout out to Mark Howard at Georgetown, who's just done
Mhm.
incredible in custody work and Jesuit level, where universities just kind of across the country are finding uh, a different way to get creative with, student support, academia,
Mhm.
about how to support the court system and kind of in
Yeah.
custody institutions.
I'm going to show you really quick. All right, so Mark Howard actually started his in-prison programming with us, but
Mhm.
I'll show you the thing that my students loved about Mark Howard, and that is that this is Kim Kardashian. This is Nick Howard, Nick
Right.
Cannon.
I can't hand, right?
Yeah, and this is Gina Belafonte.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I will say about Mark is that when he came in, he was like, it's a quality program, just like if it was the real Georgetown campus, the brick and
Right.
mortar campus. This is our, I think he called it the DC arm of the southeast arm of Georgetown.
Right.
But the students, there's a picture there with all of them in a Georgetown t-shirt,
Yeah.
and it meant so much to them to have been, especially in DC, where they've seen Georgetown but never had access to it.
Right.
Never had access to it as before they were incarcerated, and then to have access during and then possibly when they're released. That kind of programming is invaluable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if I could just kind of close out and kind of, this just makes me think where, we think so much about kind of how much criminal conviction has an effect on someone. And there's, a whole lot of debt to society to repay. But when we start thinking about just being equals and just kind of people that share the same community, right? There's a lot more opportunity and access and growth that we get where the lower our barriers are, right? The more kind of connection and progress we make with utilizing these resources, investing in education and in collaboration, where, so many of our demons kind of hide in isolation, right? And so
Yeah.
when we actually stay connected and can teach the behavior where we ask for help and are a bit more vulnerable about where we are, we're seeing really impactful change across the system and working with these populations.
And man, my hat's off to everybody who works in this field because it's difficult. And every time you have 2 steps forward, you feel like something happens. It's a gut punch, right, with
Yeah.
somebody that you couldn't really help or whatnot, and you're just so tired a lot of times. So I just appreciate you all hanging in there and recruit, right? We need more and more young people to really see the need and to step up and help with this work.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just powerful for people to be curious, right, across all these different
Mhm.
industries and just know that there's a different approach happening, right? And I just want to thank you for all the work that you put in. And so honored to kind of be able to share in our professional growth that's kind of happening simultaneously. And I'm lucky to have you as a colleague to kind of share your knowledge and expertise.
Feel the same.
Great. Well,
Thanks for having me.
thanks so much, Dr. Lopez. And thanks everyone again for attending on this Friday afternoon. I know it's getting late out in DC, but we'll go ahead and circulate
Quitting time.
we'll circulate this video after we post it to YouTube and send out an invite to our next speaker series that's going to be in May. We're actually going to be talking to a victims witness coordinator who works in the U.S. Attorney's Office to kind of talk about her work. And so thank you all for being here, and you'll get the video shortly. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.